couple of years ago, I was reading a book on history, some part of European history, and I became somewhat intrigued by the topic of monarchies. In the history of Europe, of course, there are many kingdoms and monarchies and so on, and the question came to me, how does a monarchy begin? How does a group of people, tribes, villages, whatever, reach a point where they are led, even ruled by a monarch, by one person or one family that rules? I wasn't trying to start my own monarchy, but I was just thinking to myself, how does it begin? How does a monarchy suddenly begin? There are obviously different ways that it happens, different types of situations that could lead to it. And I, of course, didn't or haven't studied every single monarchy or empire in history, but usually it seems that a people realize that there's something that they want or something that they need as a people that they cannot do on their own. And most of the time it has to do really with safety or defense. There's they're surrounded by, there are these hostile tribes or invaders, other people, or they might want to be that hostile tribe. They might want to conquer. They might want more land. Or perhaps that desire to conquer comes from a need. They need better food or better irrigation, agriculture, or whatever. Bottom line is there's a need to go beyond themselves individually or themselves as this small family or village unit and in a sense unite as a group. Or more importantly, to have someone unite them as a group and then lead them and organize them. There's always that leader at the beginning, and when that is successful, there's a certain thanks or I guess affection, and perhaps that's how monarchies generally begin. For example, part of this book that I was reading was describing the kingdom of Hungary. Hungary was a kingdom for almost 1,000 years, really, until the early part of the 20th century. And it became a kingdom in the year 1000 with Saint Stephen. Saint Stephen was crowned king of those people. He was a leader, a military leader, that united the people and led them in defending themselves and in conquering. And later on, he showed a great care for those people with his charity, works for the poor, and became a saint. Not every monarch, very few in fact, become saints. But his story in many ways was typical, I suppose, of the beginnings of many monarchies. Biblically, the people of Israel, they wanted a king because they wanted what other kingdoms had, power, wealth, land, and they felt that they could not have it on their own. They needed a king to unite them. In the first book of Samuel, they asked God, please give us a king to govern us, to lead us, so that we can have what the other kingdoms have. So in a way, that's generally, I suppose, how monarchies begin, how a group of people have a king or a queen or an emperor over them. Looking at some of these monarchs, one of the interesting, I suppose, characteristics, especially of a good monarch, one who has this real connection with the people, with a good monarch, the people recognize something of themselves in the monarch. Now, of course, it can happen that an invader comes from another people, another tribe, and conquers them and starts to rule over them. But then in those cases, there's no real connection really between the monarch and the people. With a good monarch, one that people genuinely love and follow, their identity as a people is somehow represented or even embodied in their king or their queen. They see something of themselves in their monarch. And again, it's a challenge with foreign peoples and also with the amount of intermarriage that happens with the royal families. But deep down, this is what happens. Again, all these little tidbits that I'm reading recently about the Queen of Denmark, how she's been queen in Denmark for a number of decades, not as long as Queen Elizabeth, but many years, and she's very popular actually among the people. Over 80%, I think, approval or affection for her. She's beloved there. And a major reason is that the Danish people see themselves in their queen. She's very much Danish. She grew up there. She had Danish parents and grandparents. I think she was born in the Danish royal palace. She's lived there all her life. But then she's also very caring, loyal. She's faithful to her people and her duty because she recognizes something of herself in them. She doesn't just see herself as the ruler of some random people. They're her people. She's one of them. And so there's this mutual affection and care. This does not always happen with monarchs, as history has shown, with uprisings and all kinds of, revolutions that occur to overthrow monarchies and so on. So there's not always this mutual love and affection. Not always they lived happily ever after. That often doesn't happen. All of this then can give a background to the kingship of Jesus Christ. Acknowledging Jesus Christ as king is something that goes back to the beginnings of Christianity. And as we heard, it has biblical roots right there in the gospel. This particular feast, though, was instituted by Pope Pius XI in 1925. He felt a need at that time in the world's history to have the church express and proclaim what she'd always believed, that Christ is the King of kings, King of the universe. And there was a document he wrote. There's always a document. There's a number of interesting points from the document that he wrote to institute the feast. And one of them actually pertains to Christ's kingship itself, how it began and what its roots are. We often consider Jesus as king, and I still do, primarily because of what he did. He's king because he's the Redeemer. He reigns from the cross, the beautiful image of the crown of thorns. Jesus became king when he died on the cross and brought about our salvation. Obviously that is true, but what Pius XI pointed out is that the kingship of Christ has an even deeper root in his very identity. And he points to some of the patristic writing from the early centuries of the church that explained that it was the incarnation itself that gave Christ his authority to rule. He said, by essence and by nature, Christ is king. Through the incarnation, that is, as we know, when the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, the Son who was existing from eternity, assumed a human nature, humanity was then drawn into the fullness of God. That's the power of the incarnation. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Ultimately, humanity, this part of creation, was drawn into the fullness of God in a way it never was, in this very, very singular way. In that document, Pius XI wrote, Christ's kingship is founded upon the ineffable hypostatic union, the incarnation. By reason of this union, Christ has power over all creations. Theological language, this important theological language, but gives the point that Jesus' very identity as the Word made flesh, as God made man, all of creation then submits to him as king and ruler. And then, in addition to this, he's our loving Redeemer. The Pope actually writes that it's an even greater joy and consolation that he rules from the cross. He doesn't rule from domination and power. He rules from the cross, from this self-giving love. And then he goes on that an important consequence, therefore, of this kingship is that it's not restricted to Christians, nor is it restricted to only spiritual or religious things. It primarily is, of course, my kingdom is not of this world. But the Pope writes, it would be a grave error to say that Christ has no authority whatever in civil affairs. Again, because of that identity as the God who rules over all creation, the kingship of Christ extends to all of human existence, from the spiritual also to the worldly. This then is a daring claim. It's one thing to have our own liturgical feast, our own theological understanding, to acknowledge Christ as king in the life of the church, in the spiritual life, and so on. But to say that Christ's kingship extends to everyone and everything, that's a very daring claim. How dare we claim that Jesus Christ should have kingship over everything? His kingdom's not of this world. This is our world. We run things. We do things our way. Ultimately, it gets to that point. But it is important that we make that daring claim, no matter what the opposition might be. Again, this feast, now almost 100 years ago, was instituted precisely because things in the world and in much of society were, in many places, in turmoil. This was the time between the two world wars. There was the threat of communism and fascism. He recognized the need to proclaim the kingship of Christ. In our day, we have our obvious challenges in the world, in our society, in the church, in families, wherever. We all know what they are. And so this need for the kingship of Christ to extend beyond the merely interior is important. But how do we make Christ the king of society? Ultimately, it does need to begin in that interior way. And I think by looking at monarchies in the human world, as I was mentioning, we can in some ways find our answer. We're looking to Jesus Christ. We do see in some way our identity in him. There's that beautiful text from the Second Vatican Council. Christ fully reveals man to man himself. It's only by looking to Jesus Christ that we find our deepest identity as human beings. Our deepest identity is not in our ethnicity or our family or all of these things that are important. Our deepest identity comes from looking to Jesus Christ. And then just like the great monarchs, we allow Christ to then recognize himself in us in a mysterious way. At the heart of the spiritual life, it's that. It's not so much looking to Christ and trying to imitate him, but in a sense allowing him to make that transformation so that he sees himself in us, so that the Father recognizes his Son in us. And the challenge with that is that, as daring as it is, we really don't want that as human beings. We don't want to see our full identity in Christ because it has consequences, because it means saying no to myself, making sacrifices, going through difficult moments, maybe being opposed by the world, challenged by society, and even persecuted. And so as much as we pay lip service to Christ as King, we really don't want the fullness of what it involves. Ultimately, the fullness we see when we gaze on the cross. But it's so important that we do recognize and strive to achieve that identity, because although the consequences in this world are difficult and sometimes might involve the cross, the greatest consequence is what came after the cross, the glory of the resurrection. And so only then can we enter the fullness of that kingdom, where Christ's fullness as King is achieved in the heavenly kingdom that he came to give us.